Hello everyone, welcome to our TJ Comments and Answers channel. I hope all of you are doing well. In this video, we're going to prepare for the Enjoy Life book study. This week, we'll be studying Chapter 7, covering chapters 1 through 8, plus the sidebar. So, let's get started. Question 1 and 2. What happened when the enemies of God's people tried to hinder the kingdom work? Contrary to expectations, persecution did not halt the spread of the kingdom message. Dispersed disciples became bearers of good news in various lands, and instead of extinguishing the Christian faith, persecution contributed to its spread. This episode reveals how attempts to stifle the kingdom's hour can trigger unforeseen consequences, resulting in a greater dissemination of faith. When the enemies of God's people tried to hinder the kingdom work, they unleashed a wave of cruel persecution led by Saul. This attack led the disciples to flee Jerusalem. However, instead of halting the spread of Christianity, persecution had an unexpected effect. The dispersed disciples began to preach the good news in the lands they had fled to, further extending the kingdom's work. This historical event highlights how attempts to halt the kingdom's advance can result in its expansion rather than its cessation. Subtitle: Those who had been scattered. Question 3, Part A. Who was Philip? Philip was one of those who had been scattered and headed to the city of Samaria as an evangelizer. Later, about 20 years after the events recounted in Acts 8, his preaching territory was established. Luke mentions him when Paul and his companions were heading to Jerusalem. Philip was known as the evangelizer and had 4 unmarried daughters who prophesied, indicating he remained active in his ministry and had taught his family to love and serve Jehovah. Philip was a disciple of Christ who played a significant role in spreading the gospel according to the biblical account in the book of Acts. He was noted for his evangelistic work and willingness to fulfill the missions entrusted to him. Due to persecution, Philip went to Samaria, and his preaching there was successful, with the people accepting the word of God. Besides his work in Samaria, Philip also had a significant encounter with an Ethiopian eunuch, guiding him to Christian faith by explaining the scriptures. After these events, Philip settled in Caesarea, where he continued his evangelistic work and established his home with his family. He is described as the evangelizer there, and it is mentioned that he had 4 unmarried daughters who prophesied. Thus, we can say he was a faithful disciple who played an important role in spreading the gospel, both in Samaria and Caesarea, and raised his daughters in the Christian faith, demonstrating his dedication and commitment to the preaching and teaching ministry. Question 3, Part B. Why had most people in Samaria not heard the kingdom message? What did Jesus predict about Samaria? Most people in Samaria had not heard the kingdom message because Jesus had instructed his apostles specifically not to enter any city of Samaria during his earthly ministry. In Matthew 10 verses 5 to 6, Jesus commanded the apostles not to go in the way of the Gentiles or enter any city of the Samaritans, but rather to go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Jesus had predicted that the apostles should not initially enter any city of Samaria. However, he later prophesied that Samaria would receive a full testimony. This was fulfilled when Philip, one of the scattered ones, brought the message to Samaria, demonstrating Jesus' broad vision for spreading his teachings. Though Jesus had predicted that Samaria would receive a full testimony in the future, before ascending to heaven, he told his disciples they would be his witnesses in Jerusalem, all Judea, and Samaria. This prophecy of Jesus indicated that the gospel message would reach even the farthest regions of the earth, signaling the global expansion of gospel preaching, including Samaria, despite the ethnic and religious tensions between Jews and Samaritans at that time. Question 4. How did the Samaritans react when Philip preached to them, and what could be a reason? The Samaritans showed a receptive attitude toward the message Philip shared with them. One possible reason could be that they noticed the difference between Philip and other religious leaders of the time. Philip broke with tradition by preaching without making distinctions of class and showed inclusive love to all, thus challenging the negative expectations Samaritans might have had about Jews and their religious leaders. This inclusive and loving attitude of Philip towards them was refreshing and comforting for the Samaritans, who were not accustomed to receiving such treatment from Jews. When Philip preached to the Samaritans, they reacted positively and paid close attention to his message. The reason for this reaction could be that the Samaritans were used to being marginalized and despised by the Jews, and they could also sense rejection from the Pharisees, who were known for their closed-minded attitude and prejudices. Therefore, the Samaritans reacted positively to Philip's message because they found in him a messenger who offered them hope, love, and acceptance, thus breaking down the social and religious barriers that existed between them and the Jews. Question 5-7. Share an experience demonstrating how persecution has contributed to reaching more places with the message. During World War II, Nazi persecution failed to stop Jehovah's Witnesses preaching. Even in concentration camps, despite harsh conditions and constant danger, witnesses continued to share their faith with other prisoners. A Jewish man who encountered witnesses in a Nazi concentration camp was impressed by their bravery and conviction. This encounter led him to study the Bible with them and eventually become a Jehovah's Witness. This experience highlights how persecution contributes to the spread of the Christian message. It was evidenced in Mozambique during the 1970s when Jehovah's Witnesses were forced to flee Malawi due to persecution. Preaching did not cease in Mozambique despite facing hostilities. Brother Francisco Coana emphasizes that, despite detentions and obstacles, the positive response from many reaffirmed the belief that God was on their side, reflecting the experience of first-century Christians. Another example is that of an SS officer in the Gusen concentration camp, Austria, who agreed to study the Bible with a witness named Franz Desch. Years later, Franz and the officer reunited at an assembly, but this time the officer was also a publisher of good news, showing how even persecutors can be reached by the kingdom message. Additionally, persecution often forces Christians to flee to other countries, taking the kingdom message to new areas. For example, in the 1970s, many Jehovah's Witnesses had to flee from Malawi to Mozambique due to persecution. Despite facing new difficulties in Mozambique, such as government persecution, witnesses continued to preach and found people willing to listen and accept the kingdom message, demonstrating that persecution cannot stop the spread of the kingdom message. Question 8. What effect have political and economic changes had on preaching? Political and economic changes have significantly influenced preaching dynamics. Forced migration, for example, has led to the spread of Christianity to new regions as displaced people find refuge in diverse places. This has required religious communities to adapt to different languages and cultures to continue effective preaching. These political and economic changes, along with massive migrations due to wars, poverty, and other factors, have had a significant impact on Christian preaching in recent decades. These events have led many people to move countries, creating new opportunities for them to hear the gospel message and study the Bible in their new places of residence. The arrival of refugees and migrants has generated the need to preach in multiple languages to effectively communicate the kingdom message to people of different cultures and linguistic backgrounds. This phenomenon highlights the importance of being prepared to testify to people of all nations, tribes, peoples, and languages in our surroundings, as urged in Revelation 7 verse 9. Each of us has a responsibility to strive to share the gospel message with those around us, regardless of their origin or language, so that they may have the opportunity to know the truth and make a decision to support Jehovah and His kingdom. Analysis of the sidebar on page 53. Philip the Evangelizer. The apostles sent Peter and John to Samaria after hearing that the people there had accepted the word of God. Philip, who was preaching in Samaria, may have informed the governing body about the progress of preaching in this region, leading the apostles to send Peter and John to consolidate and strengthen the new believers. The title, The Evangelizer, indicated that Philip was dedicated to preaching the gospel and expanding the Christian faith. Although the Bible applies this term to those who preach in places where the message has not yet been proclaimed, it can be inferred that Philip continued to be active in his ministry since he is mentioned as such even after several years. The fact that Philip had 4 unmarried daughters who prophesied is highlighted to show that he had taught his family to love and serve Jehovah. This underscores the importance of teaching and transmitting faith within the family and demonstrates the depth of Philip's commitment to his faith and his desire to share God's message with others, even through his family. In this context, prophesying probably refers to the ability of Philip's daughters to communicate messages inspired by God or to share spiritual teachings. This suggests that Philip's daughters were actively involved in religious service and had a significant role among the Christian brotherhood. Well, those have been the practical answers regarding this week's congregation book study. I hope it is very helpful for you, my dear brothers and sisters. Sending you a big hug, and may Jehovah bless and protect you always.